I read the article George Whitefield, Pedlar and Divinity by Frank Lambert, which is in it he discusses the techniques used by the 18th century evangelist George Whitefield to promote his ministry in England and the American colonies. And this was a very interesting article which discussed an element of Whitefield's ministry not often examined, namely the marketing of the message. Whitefield was ahead of his time in his marketing techniques, and frankly, he was very effective in his promotions, and he was also aided by a great team of men. George Whitefield was a very successful and respected minister. David T. Morgan, in his George Whitefield and the Great Awakening in the Carolinas and Georgia, 1739 to 1740, wrote that no one less than the great Dr. Franklin said of him, "I, who was intimately acquainted with him, never had the least suspicions of his integrity, but am to this day decidedly of the opinion that he was in all his conduct a perfectly honest man, and methinks my testimony in his favor ought to have the more weight as we have no religious connection." William Howard Kinney, in his article George Whitefield, the Center Priest of the Great Awakening, 1739 to 1741, reports that George Whitefield made 7 trips to America during his lifetime. For instance, as an example, in his tour from 1739 to 1740, he drew 20,000 people to the Boston Common to hear him, and while 15,000 gathered on Society Hill in Philadelphia. These are just 2 examples of the many thousands of people Whitefield drew to his open services across not only America, but in England, Scotland, and Ireland as well. Well, Whitefield led revivals in England, Scotland, and throughout the American colonies. And he used some techniques that were relatively new for the time. I hate to use the analogy of modern social media, but it just seems so very apt here. He didn't invent all of these techniques himself, but he was a good promoter. He used these new methods to good effect to promote his revival and the message he was attempting to get out to the people. Months in advance of the revivals he led, he and his team would use articles, pamphlets, and tracts to promote his appearances. He even partnered with Benjamin Franklin and Franklin Systems and newspapers to promote his ministry. Whitefield would write some of the press himself, and he also brought huge amounts of printed material with him to distribute to those who couldn't afford the materials. And this included not only poor whites, but also slaves in his ministry to the slaves. Whitefield was not without his critics, and some of the established churches felt his methods were undignified and not really in keeping with the church. Whitefield's use of advance notice and follow-up publicity in the form of his printed sermons, newspaper, magazine stories, encouraged not only conversion, but the use of techniques by revivalists in the future. We can see some of the techniques that would be used by revivalists like Billy Graham 200 years in the future being used by Whitefield. And like Graham, these new techniques would draw huge crowds. Crowds that might not have turned out to hear the message had it not been for the advanced publicity and information that was provided by Whitefield and his team.